Welcome to the Envision Podcast. My name is Bhagya, and I manage partnerships and business development at Envision. This is episode 2 of the AI in Accessibility series. And today we are going to be diving into some critical topics around education, employment, and assistive technology in the workplace. And joining us today for the discussion is Dr. Michele McDonnall, who is the director of the National Research and Training Center on Blindness and Low Vision, and a research professor at Mississippi State University with over 2 decades of published studies on these topics, who we also had the pleasure of meeting for the first time earlier this year at the CSUN Assistive Technology Conference. And since then, we've been very keen on getting Dr. McDonnall on the podcast with us. Dr. McDonnall, it's a pleasure to have you on the show with us. I'd love to pass it on to you to give us a quick introduction to yourself before we dive into the topics that we want to discuss.
Sure, thank you. Yes, thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast. So I've been with the NRTC, which is the abbreviation for our center, since 2003, so 21 years here. We are funded by NIDLR, which is the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. And the focus of our research is on improving employment outcomes for people who are blind or have low vision. And in my background before coming here, I have my PhD in rehabilitation, research, and education. And I've worked in the field of disabilities for probably 30 years. And previously did direct service to people with traumatic brain injuries before getting into the blindness and low vision area.
That's awesome. The reason I'm excited is also because at Envision, over the past 3.5 years, we've been working on Envision for Enterprise. Our thesis in terms of introducing Envision for Enterprise was focused around understanding how assistive technology could play a part in enabling and empowering people who are blind and who have low vision, who are part of the workforce, and also looking at how we could be involved in the process of kind of improving opportunities for finding employment for people who are blind and low vision. I think for the purpose of the conversation, I'm going to abbreviate it to BLV people moving forward. But Dr. Michele, I'd love to kind of kick things off discussing education before we start jumping into the employment side of things. And I know you've done a number of studies surrounding education and its importance around finding employment. And the studies have shown that education level and the degree major for college graduates significantly influence employment outcomes for BLV college graduates. What would people who are BLV and professionals who work with them, what should they know about these studies in particular, if you are in a position to kind of give us a quick summary of the education side of things?
Sure. So higher education level has consistently been associated with better employment outcomes in almost every single study it's been included in. So I do consider it the most important predictor of employment for people who are blind or have low vision, at least in terms of factors or variables that are typically measured in these studies. I think there are certainly factors that aren't measured that could be more important, but in terms of factors that we can measure and study, I do think education and having a higher education level is really important for employment. And higher education level is also associated with higher earnings, as it is for everyone, regardless of what their vision level is. But even when considering education level, people with blindness or low vision have lower earnings on average than people who are sighted. So I think it's important for people who are blind or have low vision, for their parents, for professionals, to be aware of that relationship, that higher education, it results in a greater likelihood of being employed, and the person is also more likely to have higher earnings. So I think it's important for everyone to be aware of that. And for example, for teachers, students with visual impairments, I think they should encourage post-secondary education and be sure to prepare the students they're working with to succeed in college.
I think that's a great point, right? I think preparation is something that is critical for anyone, not just for people who are blind or low vision. With that in mind, I know that the NRTC have also created a number of resources over the years that could be useful for students, maybe also educators who are teaching people who are blind and low vision. Could you kind of touch very briefly on what some of those resources could be? And of course, we'll be dropping the links in the captions as well as in the descriptions. But could you touch very briefly on what some of those resources could be?
Sure. One of the resources that we've had for a very long time is the transition activity calendar, available on our own website, and started off as it's so old that it started off as a paper copy. We used to give out paper copies of it.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I think it's originated in the 80s, but basically it's about what the youth needs to do, the student needs to do when they're in high school. And even there's a few things pre-high school that they should be doing to be sure they're ready to transition to college. So it's specifically focusing on that. And, we created it for use by anybody. It could be individuals who are blind or have low vision, their parents, but it turned out that TVIs, teachers of students with visual impairments, have been the primary audience for this. They have used this over the years to help their students be prepared to go to college. So that's a longstanding resource that we have. And then kind of as the resource was the foundation behind the idea for another resource that we have, which is the 4 to 24 app.
Okay.
And that is it's kind of like a much expanded version of the transition activity calendar. And it was created for youth with blindness or low vision between the ages of 16 and 24, but it was also created for parents of youth with blindness or low vision between the ages of 4 to 24, hence the name of the app. So it has advice for not just transitioning to college. It doesn't have that information, but it has information about all the things that parents can be doing when the child is very young to help prepare them for independence and ultimately for employment in the future.
That's amazing. So if I'm correct, Dr. McDonnell, it is the website for the NRTC is blind.msstate.edu. Is that correct?
.edu, yes, that's our basic or our primary website.
Mhm.
And from that website, you can get to our other websites. And the 4 to 24 app information about that is under our products page
Gotcha.
on the blind.msstate.edu. But like you said, we'll put direct
links in. Yeah, I think for any of our listeners who's kind of listening while they're driving or just audio first, I just wanted to read out the website just so that they can also drop in. I'm looking at it as we speak, and there's so many resources in here that we just don't have the time to dive much deeper into. But I think for anybody listening in, it's very, very worthwhile dropping into the website and checking all of the resources that are available there.
Yeah. And going back to your original question about degree major, that was something I did want to touch on that we found in some recent studies that we did.
Sure, I'd love to hear about it.
Okay, so we know, as I mentioned, that there is an earnings gap between people who are blind or low vision and people who are not, even when you consider their education level. And so we wondered if college degree major, for people who do have a bachelor's degree, if college degree major may be one of the factors that is causing that earnings gap. So, and we know that college degree major is associated with employment and earnings for everyone,
Right.
Not people who are blind or have low vision, for everyone. So, for example, business majors and people in STEM majors, the science, technology, engineering, math, have the highest employment rates and tend to have the highest earnings and employment rates. And then art-related majors have and education have some of the lowest employment and earnings. So we compared, in this study we used American ACS data, American Community Survey data, and we compared degree majors between the groups. So, and that the groups being people with blindness or low vision and people who are sighted.
Right.
And so compared to people with blindness or low vision, people with blindness and low vision are more likely to have degrees in some of the lower paying fields. So, for example, they're more likely to have degrees in the broad areas of education and consumer services and recreation. So those are some of the lowest paying broad degree fields.
Right.
And people with blindness and low vision are less likely to have degrees in higher paying degree fields like engineering and then biological, agricultural, and environmental sciences. So we did find some small gaps in those, but those gaps are, they're pretty small. So, but that may explain a little bit of the difference in earnings.
Now, I'm jumping a little bit ahead here because a question just popped into my mind when you just mentioned that for the BLV candidates in question, that like biology and STEM were fields with kind of less employment shown. Do you think it's because and I know that you may not have an exact answer for this based off of your studies, but I'm curious to know your thoughts on whether you think that assistive technology and whether the somewhat, let's say, restrictions of screen readers play a part in these kind of fields of study that could be creating a little bit of that gap there?
Sure. I think potentially that the science fields are less accessible.
Mhm.
And I know that there are people doing research on that and trying to come up with ways to make the different science fields more accessible. So yeah, I definitely think is an issue there.
Right. Awesome. So honestly, I think we're off to a great start with discussing the education side of things. As we kind of move into the employment aspect following education, before we jump into aspects of the actual employment, I want to kind of quickly touch again on barriers. Your research has investigated multiple barriers to employment for people who are blind and low vision. I was wondering if you could kind of break down some of those most notable barriers that you've come across.
Sure. Yeah. So we kind of categorize the barriers as internal and external.
Mhm.
So internal, kind of within the person, and then external, more within the environment. So some of the internal barriers that we see or that we're aware of is our lack of skills or low level of skills.
Mhm.
And it might be blindness specific, the person may know how to use a screen reader, but not be very skilled in using it effectively. Or those could be work-related skills. Another internal barrier is difficulty showcasing their skills or abilities. For example, like having a resume that doesn't look good or not interviewing well.
Right.
And then fear of losing government benefits is a barrier. Discouraged from difficulty finding employment is another barrier. They may begin to think it's impossible for them to become employed. And then there is also some people who don't believe in their own ability to work. And we see this especially if they lose their vision later in life. They may just, they believe that they can't work anymore. And then another major internal barrier we're seeing is other health problems or chronic conditions or additional disabilities. So recent research we've done has really emphasized this problem. And then in terms of external barriers, negative attitudes of employers. That's been one that's been around a long time and talked about a lot.
And we'll talk about that in a bit as well, but
Yes. Yeah. And then inaccessible work environments, and primarily, in terms of inaccessible, thinking in terms of digital inaccessibility, company software, inaccessible digital documents, things like that. Transportation is another external barrier. Not having access to the AT the person may need for the job is another barrier. And then shortage of blindness professionals. We consider that a barrier because there aren't enough specialists in blindness rehabilitation, like O&M instructors or AT instructors, to really provide the services for the people out there who need them. So yeah, those are the major barriers that we've identified.
Yeah, I think that's really comprehensive in terms of understanding internal and external barriers. I want to kind of follow up on that in two ways. I think the first one is more of a comment on my end, which is, I think some of the internal barriers that you mentioned regarding the aspects of self-belief and maybe the loss of that confidence for people who are blind later in life. Particularly, I think is something that we've also experienced over the years when we were exploring and just trying to validate Envision for Enterprise. I think the employers' attitudes, again, we'll touch on it in a little bit, is something that over the past 4 years, at least in our experience, we've seen is something that is improving. But when we get to that topic, I'm going to throw out a few questions to you as well, based off, and I want to see kind of what that correlation and what we've seen improving over the years has been as well. But before we kind of move into those aspects, I want to also ask you again, and this is something that I'll probably do a bit more often than we generally do in with other podcast guests. But are there any steps and resources that you would recommend for somebody looking to enter the workforce to best position themselves for success?
Yeah, I think, thinking about those barriers, I think there are a number of things that people can do. And, first being, I would say, ensure that you have the skills needed for the job you're applying for. Know what AT will be needed for that job, make sure you're skilled with that AT, and then know what work-related skills are required and make sure you have those skills. And then also ensure that your resume presents you well and documents that you have the needed skills for the job. So, for people who are blind or have low vision, if they can't see the resume, they really need to ensure that the formatting looks correct. They need to get someone else to help them ensure that it looks good. And also have just other people review the resume for, is this going to read well for an employer? Is an employer going to look at this favorably? So, and then also be prepared to present themselves well in the interview. And those are things that, anyone needs to do, regardless of blindness or low vision. Anyone needs to do all of those things. Make sure they have the skills for the job, make sure their resume presents them well, make sure they interview well, right? So those for anyone. But then for someone with blindness or low vision, they also need to think about how and when they want to disclose their vision impairment. So, because that's a very important thing. Do you want to, is it something you want to talk about up front? Would you put it in a cover letter? Would you sort of indicate it in your resume with experiences you've had with, certain organizations for people who are blind, that kind of thing? Would you want to not disclose it in your resume and just talk about it in the interview? Those are important things for people to think through before they start applying for jobs. And we do have a resource sheet about this on our website and a recording of a webinar on that topic. And that was a really good webinar. So I would encourage people to check that out if you're thinking about how to disclose. And then also in the interview, people need to be prepared to talk about their blindness or low vision and be prepared to explain how they can perform the essential functions of the job. So I think even if the interviewer doesn't ask them how they could perform the essential functions of the job, they may be wondering how they could, being blind, because they may just not have any idea how someone who's blind could, even use a computer. They might not have any idea how a blind person uses a computer. So,
exactly.
So being prepared to talk about that and bring it up if it's not, if the person doesn't bring it up, because I think a lot of times interviewers, they don't know what they can and can't ask, and they may be scared to ask the thing. And, so I think just being proactive and forthcoming with information like that is going to be really important. And then, did you have a question about that?
No, I was just going to comment, but I'll wait for you to finish your because I a lot of things that you said have resonated with some of the things that I was thinking about looking when we were discussing the question as well. But please finish and then I can jump in.
Okay. And transportation is another thing that tends to be a barrier. So have that figured out, including a backup plan if your primary option isn't going to be available. You do not want to be in a situation where I can't get to work and I can't solve that problem. So another thing though, I think this is important for people to use the resources available to them because they are blind or have low vision. So there are things like vocational rehabilitation services in the United States.
Yes.
There are across the country, there are nonprofits specifically for people who are blind or have low vision.
Exactly. And that's actually what I was going to jump in and say earlier as well, right? Because I think understanding the role, like you mentioned, there's a lot of things that everyone needs to do that people who are blind and low vision need to do as well, on top of all of the other factors that you just mentioned.
Right.
But understanding which AT you would need is probably not that straightforward for somebody who is blind and low vision as well, just because of the fact that there is a lot of different types of AT available. And like you just mentioned, working with work rehab and going to nonprofits and other institutions like the lighthouses that are available in multiple states. We work closely with different lighthouses, and we know that they generally have their own showcase stores and locations where they have basically a full range of different assistive technology devices and softwares that you can already familiarize yourself with. And I think knowing the people that are part of these organizations, they're generally also very willing and ready to help anyone that needs to also understand what AT that they may need for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some organizations around that people may not be as aware of. And I won't necessarily go into all of them here, but I will say we do have a recorded about leveraging your disability to find a job that includes guests from some of those organizations like Inclusively, Insight, Thriving
Yeah.
Blind Academy. So again, that's on our website. We'll link to where you can find that if you're interested in that.
Yes. So we'll be dropping all the links that we're talking about, but like we mentioned, I think it'd be highly advised for anyone who's listening in that is looking to apply for jobs in the near future to check those webinars out, because particularly the resources that Dr. Michelle mentioned may not be something that you're aware of, and it's always good to know, good to get to know what you don't know before you start to apply for the jobs as such. So now that I think we've gone pretty deep into the barriers aspect of things, one thing that was brought up there was the employer side of things, right? So a few things that we just mentioned was, and this is something that we've experienced ourselves in reaching out to some organizations, is that employment is generally handled through human resource departments who have the actual talent teams under it. And they may or may not have people who have experience or expertise with people who are blind, low vision, or have other disabilities. So what I'd love to kind of jump into next is understanding the employer's perspective of things. Could you walk us through some of the key findings from your studies that you've done over the years on the employer's implicit and explicit attitudes towards the competence of people who are blind? And like, were there any particular kind of practices that resulted in improvement of any like potential negative predispositions or biases?
Okay, sure. We've done quite a bit of research over the past almost 15 years about employer attitudes.
Mhm.
And I want to tell you about one of the most recent, well, it's actually not one of the most recent, but one of the ones we did in the last grant cycle. But, we know that there are long-held societal beliefs about incompetence and dependence of people who are blind. And that's what we think contributes to, poor employment outcomes for the population. But we know that people are often unwilling to openly express negative attitudes, or they may even be unaware of implicit bias they have.
Mhm.
So in this study, we wanted to measure both implicit attitudes as well as explicit attitudes. And so explicit attitudes are those attitudes that you are aware of and that you could report. And we can do a survey. We could ask you about attitudes in a survey. Those are explicit attitudes. So that's kind of what people typically think of as attitudes. But then there's implicit attitudes, which are unconscious thoughts or biases about groups of people. Like a really simple one might be, people might have the unconscious bias that men or boys or men are better at math than girls or women are. That's kind of one of those long-held societal beliefs, I guess, that people may have. So, and then there's also the implicit potential about the competence of people who are blind. So for this study, we had 59 hiring managers who worked for a financial services company. It was people who worked for one company who participated in a 1-hour meeting with a VR professional. And this is an intervention study. So the intervention was that 1-hour meeting. And we had 2 VR professionals who implemented the study. One was sighted and one was blind. And we had them use 2 different approaches for a first meeting with an employer. And the 2 approaches were either just a purely educational approach, just try to share as much information as possible about blindness and low vision with them, versus what's called a dual customer approach. And in that approach, you're focusing more on the business and learning about the business. And that's just kind of a popular approach to form relationships with an employer. So we wanted to look at those 2 approaches and have one sighted and one blind professional. So, and then implicit attitudes were measured with the IAT BVI, and explicit attitudes were measured with the employer attitudes towards blind employee scale, the EABS scale.
Okay.
And we measured people's attitudes at pre-test, which is before this meeting with the professional, and then after the meeting. And then we also did a 4-month follow-up.
Okay.
So we measured their attitudes at 3 different times. And so should I explain what an IAT BVI?
I was going to ask if you could very because then I kind of also dive into a little bit more into kind of what those findings were and what happened after 4 months.
Sure. So the IAT BVI is an implicit association test, which is basically it's a computerized sorting task that measures implicit attitudes about the competence of blind people. The association test is a type of test, and for our test, we created one specifically about competence of blind people. And then the EVES is just a survey questions, 11 that people answer on a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. And an example item is people who are blind or have low vision would be able to perform work of the same quality as sighted people at my company.
Right.
And so then there are 10 other questions like that. So that's our explicit measure. And so what we found was that explicit measures improved significantly following the meeting and remained higher in follow-up. And this was a big change or a large statistical effect. And then implicit attitudes decreased significantly, which is positive. Lower is better. So they decreased significantly following the meeting, but the size of that change was small. And one thing we were curious about was whether the type of the approach or the vision status would impact these changes. And so they didn't. Statistically, there was not a difference based on either one of those things. So even though vision status wasn't significantly associated with IAT BVI change or implicit attitude change, we did notice that the scores from people who met with the blind professional had a greater decrease. So implicit attitudes did seem to decrease more when the person met with the blind professional. So overall, our results were very positive. That 1 hour meeting did significantly improve attitudes, both kind of attitudes, big effect for the explicit, smaller effect for the implicit. That just in terms of what does that tell us? It tells us that VR professionals should get out there and meet with employers as much as possible and provide them education to help.
Yeah, my follow-up there as well, which is that given these findings, it's like there is something that is pretty low-hanging fruit that employers themselves should take the initiative for in terms of just setting up. You said how long were the sessions with the VR professionals that were conducted?
It was 1 hour.
Right. I'd be very curious to know what so much improvement we could see if it was a more structured program, right? 1 hour is already showing improvements and some positive changes. I think this is something probably that you don't have the capacity through the research center to probably do, but it's really the onus is on the employers. If I am to say so myself, to take that step, because if it's something that it can be structured in a way that you have 1 hour sessions for maybe twice a month, 1 hour sessions with the VR professionals for your human resource teams for the span of a few months of the year, it could already probably kind of have actually lasting effect on those attitudes as well as the learning process itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really interesting that the the implicit attitudes really did decrease more when the person met with the blind professionals. So and we had some other findings that would suggest that exposure to competent blind people does improve implicit attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, just as far as professionals go, just keeping that in mind that, either have a blind professional do the meetings with the employer, that can be very impactful, or, having them involved in it. And then if I could just mention one thing, we don't have this out yet, but in our latest study, we wanted to see if a video could have the same impact as an in-person meeting on changing attitudes. And we don't have those that published yet. We just finished collecting data, but the findings were positive. So we are going to be releasing this video we created. It's an interactive video. We're going to be releasing that in 2025.
That's amazing. Honestly, I'm going to say it out loud, please share it with us as well. And when I say us, I mean Envision. I'll sit down, watch the whole thing. So with Envision for Enterprise, we've been working with finding employees who work for companies who have accommodations teams internally, where we can actually work with them to get the Envision glasses in their hands, and seeing the effects of the Envision glasses over the years as well. But I think this is something that's come up quite often. I think initially I was a bit surprised to see that the lack of awareness in terms of supporting BLV employees at some very big corporations and enterprises. But I also already believe that like just having a 1 hour video that you could watch that kind of gives a lot more of the knowledge if they don't have access to, let's say, VR professionals to meet with.
Right.
I'm very happy to share that with our network and for any of our listeners when that becomes available. Awesome. So there is one interesting aspect that we didn't touch on, and I think it is something that is quite important to the subject of employment, and that's social security, right? There's different social security and welfare schemes across the world for people who are blind and low vision. I'm very curious to know what that relationship is. Like, I don't know if you actually have a study that really dives deep into this. Knowing your 2 decades of experience with these studies, you probably do. But what relationship have you seen between receiving Social Security benefits and employment opportunities, or tendency to put themselves out for looking at employment?
Yeah, we've done a number of studies that have included Social Security benefits as a factor and generally our research has shown that receiving Social Security benefits is usually a strong predictor of not working, even when you consider other factors in the model, such as having poor health. But more recently, we did a study, and this was kind of a small scale study where we were looking at employment rates for people who reported receiving Social Security benefits versus those who didn't. And this was with 2019 American Community Survey data that we did this study. But we found that only 12% of recipients worked at any time of Social Security benefit recipients worked at any time during the year. That's 12%. And that compared to almost 59% of people who weren't receiving benefits.
Right.
So obviously there's a huge gap there. And about 19 to 20% of people with blindness and low vision are receiving Social Security benefits. So that's a pretty good portion of the population that are receiving those benefits. And then, not based on our own research, but other researchers have found that once people get on Social Security benefits, especially SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, they tend to not ever go off benefits. And most people who do work, there was 12% who worked, but most people who work earn a limited amount to make sure they can continue to receive their benefits.
Understood. And you just mentioned that like 20% of the blind community are on SSDI.
Right.
I'm curious to know also, and I remember you mentioning this to me in a previous conversation, but that it's not like that straightforward. Like they may be blind, but they also probably have potentially other conditions that are preventing them from being able to be a part of the workforce. Like what percentage of that 20% do you think have other prevailing conditions as well?
Yeah, that's something we don't know. That's something I would love to do some research on to look into that, to see of those people who are blind or have low vision and are receiving service or benefits, how many of them have another condition that they may also be receiving, that also may make them eligible to be receiving those benefits. And we don't know that. I mean, we don't have any. I mean, the data's out there, but we haven't done a study to it yet. But I would love to do that study.
So yeah, I think while you were talking about it, I was thinking of it from our perspective at Envision. Like as a mandate for the company, we try to, where possible, bring in people who are blind and low vision into the Envision team. We recently brought in Charmaine, who is our community manager and a part of our customer success team, and she's been amazing. She has a history and she loves Braille. It's something that she's super passionate about. So somebody in this case who has been quite savvy and has had a lot of personal drive to learn AT. But when I think about Social Security, I think Social Security doesn't show up on your CV, right? Like I think that's an important factor to consider when we were discussing, barriers to employment and like applying for jobs and thinking about employers' attitudes. And I think when any employer looks at two candidates, it could be two blind candidates, it could be a blind candidate and a sighted candidate for the same role. I think the first thing you look at beyond the educational aspect of things, potentially for a role that's maybe a bit more senior or something along those lines, is work experience. And I suppose the years of receiving, the period of receiving Social Security doesn't show up on your CV. So I think it's also interesting when I think about it now in terms of how you view gaps in a person's CV in terms of making that decision as well. I just wanted to make that comment because it popped into my head as you were saying it, but it's an interesting aspect for any employer to consider and to ask questions, I believe, at the end of the day, because I think Social Security is an important part of the ecosystem in terms of enabling people who are blind and low vision. But it's important to ask those questions, and maybe also important from the perspective of a potential applicant for a job who has been on Social Security in the past, to kind of break down, if they're comfortable with doing so, a little bit about when they were on the Social Security benefit and now kind of what's motivating them to move back into the workforce, because it can be a powerful story as well.
Yeah, that's true. And, something that people who do have a gap in their employment history, especially if it's a larger gap, they really consider doing a different kind of resume, like a skills resume, where you're not focusing on the jobs and when you had them, but on the skills you have. So that would be another thing that people could consider.
Yeah, and I suppose the period of receiving Social Security is also, like, honestly, a great opportunity, I suppose, also if the capability is there, to use that time to kind of improve your AT skills, improve other aspects of skills that you may need. Again, could be a really good way to bridge that gap as well. So yeah, I'm already kind of it's getting me thinking quite deeply about how we do things and how employers do things in general. So we've discussed like Social Security, employment, employers' perspectives. Now I want to touch again before we jump into the assistive technology side of things, because I know that you've done recent studies which are quite eye-opening for anybody listening in, is retention, right? I think once you're in the workforce and you're part of a workforce, like, what are the key factors that influence job retention for the BLV professionals? Or even, I think it would be good to know for if there is a difference also between retention for BLV professionals who have been blind from birth versus people who maybe develop blindness or low vision later in life while they're a part of the workforce itself.
Yeah, we did a recent study specifically looking at those people who develop a vision loss later in life and whether and what impact that has on their. Let me explain just a little bit about the study so it'll make some sense.
Sure.
So we used health and retirement study longitudinal data, that's data that's been collected by the government since 1992, and it's collected every 2 years from the same people. They sign up, they agree to be in the study, and then they do a survey every 2 years. And so using that data, which is a pretty unusual data set, to have that long data like that, we identified people who were working at the wave they first reported vision loss and evaluated whether they were working at that wave they reported vision loss. So they were working before, they were working, and then they reported vision loss, and we looked at were they still working when they, once they had experienced vision loss. And the people in the sample were between the ages of 44 and 64.
Okay.
So, middle age to late middle age. And they developed vision loss between 1996 and 2018. So it was, a long span of time that they might have developed the vision loss. And we found that most people did continue to work after reporting vision loss. And, vision loss, we determined that by them rating their eyesight as poor, or if they reported being legally blind. Now, most people just had rated their eyesight as poor rather than reporting being legally blind. But so we used logistic regression to identify factors that are associated with continuing to work, with job retention. And only 4 factors ended up being significant. So we found that being female, being married or partnered, and reporting fair or better health, those were all associated with higher odds of continuing to work, whereas number of chronic health conditions was associated with lower odds of continuing to work. So, and I want to note that we did investigate several other factors that we thought might be related, and they turned out to not be related once you consider those other 4 that I just mentioned that were. So we looked at age. We thought the older, probably the more likely they would stop working. That was not a significant predictor. Race didn't matter. Education level didn't matter. This is the one study that I can remember we've ever done where education level didn't matter. And then earnings, and then having a history of emotional or psychiatric problems. None of those things were significant when you consider these other factors.
And how big was the if you don't mind me asking?
It was smaller. It was, we did not find many people in the data who met all of our criteria that we set up. We had a very rigid.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, it was just, we had a very rigid requirement for them to be in the sample. And yeah, it was less than, I don't have the number in front of me for that study right now, but it was 200 or just under or just over. It was something around that. But I did want to share a study that we did, which has not been published yet, but it's in press. It'll be out soon, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing.
Okay, so in this other study, which we were using the same set of data, although our sample was slightly different, but I would note that we had 167 people in this other study who developed vision loss, and we actually compared them to a matched group of 800 workers who didn't experience vision loss. So 800 people in this HRS data set who were matched to them on things like age, gender, race, and we looked at, if we matched people and then we looked at people who experienced vision loss, and we looked at both of these groups and what happened at when they experienced vision loss, and 60.5% of the vision loss group continued to work. So almost 40% stopped working.
Okay.
And then that compared to 87.4% of the matched group that continued to work. So obviously there was, people who did report vision loss were much more likely to stop working. Even though a majority continued to work, they were much more likely to stop working. But the really cool thing about this study is that there was a clear trend over time of increasing likelihood of job retention. So if someone reported their vision loss between 1996 and 2000, only 38.9% were working. So, pretty low percentage who were. Yep. But if they reported their vision loss between 2014 and 2018, 80.3% of them were working. So that increased, that over time, the likelihood of continuing to work after reporting vision loss increased substantially.
And was the reason for those who didn't continue to work primarily the vision loss, or was it vision loss, and this is probably not a question that you can just outright answer, was it due to some sort of trauma? Were there any correlations that you saw, any trends that you saw with the percentage of people who didn't continue to work?
So, the only things we know about them, we know what I just told you about, health seemed to be a major factor for them to not continue working. Mm-hmm. And we also know that occupation, we broad occupational categories, and people in areas like natural resources, construction and maintenance, and production, transportation, material moving, people in those kind of jobs, those obviously they're very broad categories, but people in those occupational groups were much less likely to continue working compared to people in management, business, science and arts, and sales and office jobs. So I think the job, the type of job they had contributed to whether they would continue working. But
right.
This trend we saw over time, I think, really has a lot to do with advances in AT and mainstream technologies that are accessible now. I think that's got to be part of what we're seeing here with people continuing to work after vision loss.
That's great. Again, I think you said that it's already in press. Do you have an indication of when the study will be published and available?
I don't, but yeah, it's been in press for several months, so I'm hoping it'll be pretty soon.
All right, awesome. So we'll keep an eye out for that one as well. So I think now coming down to kind of the final aspect of what we want to discuss is assistive technology. Of course, right down our alley in terms of Envision. And of course, at Envision, we've been strong believers in the fact that assistive technology can be an incredible enabler for employment of people who are blind or have low vision. And I think the genesis of that, we really started to see that when more and more employers started to offer screen reader technology to their employees. And I think from that point onwards, there have been a number of improvements that we've seen. But at the same time, I'm curious to understand first, from your studies, can you kind of help us understand what the perception of assistive technology is, and what the difference between those perceptions are between employed and unemployed individuals who are blind or have low vision?
Sure. So We're doing a current study about assistive technology in the workplace. And in that, we're surveying a group of employed people over time, but we also did some surveys with a smaller group of unemployed people. So that was one of the things we wanted to do, was kind of compare the two, the employed group and the unemployed group. And kind of what stands out in terms of those comparisons are, in terms of AT use, a lower percentage of the unemployed people were using screen reader software and braille displays. And so our sample for this particular study that we did only included people who were either totally blind or legally blind with minimal functional vision. So, to access a computer, they're going to need a screen reader, basically. So this suggests that people who are unemployed, or like a higher percentage of the people who are unemployed, weren't using a computer in their daily life. And then for people who were using screen reader software, which it was a majority of both groups that were using it, unemployed people were more likely to say they would benefit from additional training in using it compared to employed people who were screen reader users. So I think overall our findings suggest lower computer access skill among unemployed people.
Right.
And that's a major problem, because 98% of our employed sample use a computer at work. That was the big difference. But I would say overall, there were few significant differences between the employed and unemployed groups in terms of assistive technology. And, the differences that we did find, they were small in terms of a statistical effect size. And that was surprising to me, because I was kind of expected to see more differences than we found. But both employed and unemployed people in our study considered themselves to be highly skilled with their AT, and most had high AT self-efficacy.
Okay. So I'm all kind of curious to follow up a little bit more on that, because I think there's a general perception towards age and technology and like just savviness with technology. Do those trends, based off of the study of your AT studies, have you seen any particular trends between kind of seniority in age and job position, as well as kind of along with the familiarity and savviness with AT?
I can't say that we've really specifically looked at that, that we've really had a look at. I mean, off the top of my head, based on what we have looked at, I don't know that there's going to be a difference based on age in terms of how they feel about their self-efficacy for their AT skill level, but we haven't really specifically studied that. So that's a good idea for a way to look at our data.
Happy to be both. All right, so I do have like another question, and this is a bit different because it's something that, of course, we are quite interested at Envision in understanding a little bit more as well, which is wearables. And wearables within the assistive technology space, particularly whether it be for personal use or for professional use, in the grand scheme of things, has only recently begun to gain traction. For instance, the Envision Glasses have been available. If you were an early adopter, it would have been in your hands sometime in 2020, but for most people since 2021. But of course, there have been other AT wearable devices available for longer. But in the grand scheme of things, still relatively recent. And I feel like, given the feedback by users in your assistive technology studies, what challenges, opportunities do you foresee for wearables in the workplace? Because I know that it's a tough question given the landscape of wearable technology, but I'm very curious to just know where you could see wearables and what role you could see wearables playing in the employment puzzle that we've been kind of trying to discuss over the course of this conversation.
Well, first, let me say I didn't realize that Envision Glasses were that new, so I'm gaining that knowledge from this conversation. But let me share with you what we have learned from our study about wearable use at work. So we found that only a few people reported using wearables at work. In the first survey, 17 people, or 5% of our sample, used them. And they rated their skill level with the wearable device as a 6.8 on average on a scale of 1 to 10. So this was actually the lowest self-perceived skill level of any workplace AT.
Okay.
So, 6.8 doesn't sound super low, but it was very low compared to the other AT people are using. And they also had the highest percentage of users who indicated they would benefit from more training on their use. And that was 60%. So more than half of the people who are using them at work say they really could benefit from, getting more training on using them. So, not many people are using them currently, at least, but then we did ask in a recent survey about their interest in adopting novel AT, and about 29% of the people who said they were interested in adopting novel AT were interested in wearable devices or glasses.
Right.
So
Right.
I think there's definitely pretty high interest. I personally see wearable glasses as potentially the next big thing for people who are blind or have low vision, so that people can be hands-free with their AT. So, you were asking about challenges. I think a big challenge is the cost. They're just too expensive for most people. They just don't have the expendable income to pay for that. And likely employers, I think as you've may not be very willing to pay for them either at this point. And then another thing that surprised me a little bit, but another challenge I think is lack of awareness about a lot of the AT advancements that are going on among our study sample, who I consider are probably more AT savvy than like your general group of people out there who are blind or have low vision. But a lot of people in our study were not very aware of new AT or advances that are happening in products like the Envision glasses.
Yeah. And I think a bunch of things you mentioned there, I've been like nodding along as you've been saying it, is because everything you said is absolutely true. I think if you speak to anyone, just the value that a wearable, like, and in this case, a pair of like smart glasses with AT capabilities is like a no-brainer, just because being able to be hands-free and having it with you at all times is definitely something that we've heard positive feedback and just general positive outlook on. And cost is, again, something that we've been working on trying to drive down as much as possible over the last few years as well. And over the course of the existence of the Envision glasses, we've dropped the overall price down by over $1,000 in the course of these 4 years, as well as kind of introduced different additions for people who have very specific needs, so that they're not having to spend like one blanket amount for potentially features that they may not need themselves. But I think realistically, the cost aspect goes hand in hand with the employer's ability to provide that as an accommodation. And I think because like for so long that screen readers have been the go-to accommodations provision, that when it comes to discussing it, but we've also generally seen is that finding the resources for that is not something that every employer is in a position to do. And again, then it kind of falls onto the employee themselves to kind of be able to go out and find it for themselves. And that's certainly been a barrier from our experience as well. But it's like you say, I think our plan, and I think this I'm expanding purely from Envision's perspective, is also to like really dive into reducing that training barrier as well. We are working on making Envision itself a more conversational interface, where it doesn't need to, like, the user doesn't need to maybe understand every feature and how to use every single feature. And it changes over time into just being able to just ask for what you're looking for, or ask for what you need, and the software and the wearable itself being able to understand what that request is and being able to launch the feature intuitively. And kind of that's the role of AI. We've been investing in AI on our end. So I'm happy to kind of to also get those insights from you, Dr. McDonnell, to understand that this is something that people are interested in, and every single challenge that you mentioned is something that like we can acknowledge from our end, from our experience as well.
Yeah, and what you're talking about making the easier to use and more intuitive, I think that's going to be key, because that is why many people don't want to adopt new technology. It's the learning curve, it's the time. People just don't have time to spend to learn these new technologies, even if they're going to be of benefit to them in the long term. You just got to make it as simple as possible for people to learn how to use them and then to actually use them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, Dr. Michelle, it's been amazing having you on the podcast. I think we've dove into multiple aspects of really useful information based off of your studies. Of course, we will be dropping all of the links and the studies themselves that we've referenced over the course of this conversation in the description. But before we wrap things up, I want to kind of give the floor to you again. I know that you guys are working on some interesting studies that are coming up, and I'm sure that our listeners and our audience would also potentially want to be a part of those. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's and how they can potentially be a part of the studies as well?
Sure. Yeah, we currently have a mentoring survey going on and it's specifically to learn about career mentoring experiences that people have had. We know that mentoring is important for people with blindness or low vision. And there are a lot of mentoring programs out there, but we want to learn more about the specifics of what makes a successful mentoring relationship. Like, is it really important to have a blind mentor, or is it more important to have someone who works in your same field, regardless of vision status? So those are the kind of questions we're interested in. So the criteria to participate in this study is, of course, that the person be blind or have low vision, they be between the ages of 30 and 70, and they have received career mentorship, and also that they live in the United States. So those are the criteria, and this study is going to be open through the end of September. So if anyone's interested, please, go to the link that's going to be in the show note and quickly, because it won't be around that much longer. And it is a pretty short survey. It's probably 15 minutes. So there's that we're doing currently. And then, we're always initiating new projects. So we created a registry that people can sign up for if they're interested in hearing about future research projects. And so we always send out, whenever we, the NRTC, are in a study, we first go to our registry and invite people to participate, but also other researchers from other, across the country and even from other countries have asked to use our registry. So we share research announcements, widely from other.
That's awesome. I was just about to ask you, is there a place where anyone can follow up on what new studies are going to be coming up? So the registry sounds like the perfect resource. So we'll drop a link to the registry as well. And yeah, with that, I think we've come to the end of this episode of the AI and Accessibility series. Thank you so much, Dr. McDonnall, for your insights, for kind of helping us understand all of these different aspects from education to employment and assistive technology. If anyone wants to reach out to you for maybe other studies or anything along those lines, do you have a preferred email or platform that you'd like to be reached out to?
Sure. I'll just give you my email address, which is m.mcdonnall, and that is spelled McDonnall at msstate.edu. So yeah, I would love to hear from anyone who has questions about what I talked about here. And I would definitely encourage you to go to our website. We have a ton of information. We have all of our publications too. We have available on our website, all the peer-reviewed publications that are already out. They're available for download from our website.
Amazing. Thanks again, Dr. McDonnall. It's been a pleasure having you with us today. And yeah, we hope you have an incredible number of studies that go very successfully in the future.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.